Hi everybody, welcome to Right to the Top. I'm Adam. In today's video, I'm going to give you a vocabulary lesson. It's technically vocabulary, but it's also a bit of grammar, so that's why I call it English vocabulary usage. Because it's not just the word, it's how you use the word in different grammatical situations. And we're looking at the word so. And I'm going to give you 5 different ways to use the word so. Now, realistically, I put these into 5 categories, but there's a few more than 5 actual examples of the word. Now, the reason I made this video is because I see that people have a very hard time with this particular word. Because it's used in so many ways, it's very easy to get confused with how to use it. Okay? So I'm going to show you the different meanings and uses, and then we're going to look at some examples to get us going. Okay, so the most common use, the one that most people understand and use relatively easily, I think, is agreement. So when you're agreeing with someone or with something or etc., you're going to use so. Don't forget to use the inversion. And if you're not sure about inversion, you can watch my video about that. There's a link up top here. So you're inverting the subject and the verb. So Jane works very hard. So does Jack. And you have Jack as the subject, does as a verb. You've inversed. You've made the order differently, starting with so. Now, Jane works very hard, as does Jack. There are 2 ways to make this agreement. So begins an independent clause. As begins an adverb subordinate clause. So you'll notice period and comma. Now, you could use so within the sentence. Take off the comma, the period, put a comma, add the word and to make a coordinate conjunction, and then you have 2 independent clauses joined in one sentence. Jane works very hard, and so does Jack. Okay? And same idea, teaching is very hard work. You can use different verbs. It doesn't matter which verb you're using or any context, as long as you're agreeing the same thing to the same thing. So teaching is very hard work, so is studying. So is means you're talking about hard work and you're talking about studying. Be very careful. Is studying is not a progressive, present progressive tense, not doing right now. Studying here is a gerund, it's a noun. Studying is the same as teaching, and they're both very hard work. And again, as is studying. And you're inversing verb before subject. Verb is, subject, studying. Another way to do it, it's not very commonly used, but it's correct. Just as Americans love outdoor sports, so too do Canadians. Now here, I'm not adding and. I'm not putting it as 2 independent clauses, which is another way to do it is just add to. Now, it seems redundant. You have so and to basically working in the same way. So too do Canadians. The reason it seems redundant is that this so is not actually agreeing. This is the agreement. So means love outdoor sports. It's referring to something. And I'm going to get to that in a moment as well to show you a different use of so. Next, quantifier. This is another one that everybody knows commonly, but there are a few things that you have to keep in mind because they can be very confusing in how you're using the quantifier. So very simple, jewelry is so expensive, I am so sorry, the movie made so much money. So just telling you a lot, or very. It's another way to say very. Do not use this in academic writing. It's not very formal, it's very casual. In speaking, you can use it, people use it all the time. Here, Jim is so going to be fired. Now we're putting the so in front of the verb. Only in spoken English, don't do this in written English. It's very casual spoken English, okay? I'm showing it to you just because you're gonna hear it. If you're speaking to native English speakers, they say this. It's an emphasis. There's a gesture of emphasizing something to get attention, to make something bigger than it probably is. Don't do this in your writing. So I'm just showing it to you to avoid. Now, another way to add a quantifier is a quantifier with a consequence. What this means is that you're showing there's a lot of something, or something is you can use an adjective or an adverb, there's a lot, or there's a frequency or speed or whatever you want to use in an adverb, so much or so many or so often, that. Okay? That tells you that there's going to be something resulting from this. There's a consequence to this situation. And you can also use so as to, and I'll show you that separately in a moment. So occasionally, the fog is so thick, there's so much fog that, so what's the consequence? And then you're using a that noun clause, essentially, that the bridge needs to be shut down to traffic as poor visibility is a serious hazard. So the fog is so thick that you can't see anything, especially on the bridge. So they just close the bridge, and I'm using so again as a result, it's the same idea. So thick that you can't see it, they close the bridge because it's too dangerous to let people on. So thick, adjective, that clause, okay, with the result of, or the consequence of that situation. The stock's price dropped so quickly, talking about the stock market here, there's one company stock drops so quickly that it triggered a market-wide decline for the session. So this one company dropped 20% in one day. Everybody saw this happening, everybody panicked. They started selling all their other stocks, and the whole market went down for that day's trading session. Okay? So quickly, that clause, it triggered. Subject, verb. Now, so as to basically means the same thing as so something, basically it means the same as the that part of the so adjective that. So difficult as to be. Now the difference here is that after as or as to, you're not following it with a clause, you're just following it with a phrase, an infinitive phrase, to be, or in this case, to be unpassable, to do, to have, etc. The test was so difficult as to be unpassable. The test was so difficult that most of the students failed. Same idea. You're using different words, you're using a different structure. The key is not to use a conjunction after as. Use a conjunction with that. But they mean the same thing. They function in the same way. Okay. Now, you can also put so, an adjective, plus a, article a or an, depending on the noun that follows, and the noun. Then you can also add a that clause to it. So I'll show you both of these. There was not enough food for so large a crowd. There was not enough food for such a large crowd. These two sentences mean the same thing. I put this in bracket because I'm using such, not so. But when you have so, adjective, and a noun, don't forget the article. Okay, and a lot of people forget this. Again, you're probably not going to lose too many points for it, but it is noticeable to the readers. This is just adds, if you have a few other grammar mistakes, all of this is adding to your maybe less or your weakened grammar skills in the examiner's eyes for the IELTS and TOEFL. Now, if I want to add a that clause, it's basically the same idea. There's still an adjective and a noun, but there's still a consequence. There was so loud a crowd at the game. So let's say we're at a hockey game, we're in the arena, the crowd is really chanting, cheering on for their team, screaming, whistling, etc. It's so loud that the referee's whistle could not be heard over their cheers. So the referees are blowing their whistle, but the players can't hear because the crowd is so loud. So loud a crowd. Another way to write this, the crowd at the game was so loud that the referees couldn't hear the whistle, the players couldn't hear the whistle blowing. If you're ever not entirely sure that you're using a structure correctly, try to rewrite the sentence to keep the same meaning, but using a different structure if you're not sure. So loud a crowd. Again, I'm stressing that a because most people miss it. Even native speakers often miss it. Now, let's go to number 3, a third use for so. We're using it as a conjunction. And remember the so adjective that with a consequence? We're going to come back to that because people often get confused. First of all, we have 2 types of conjunctions using so. We have the coordinate, meaning independent clause. We have so plus another independent clause. He studied hard, so he passed the test. In which case, so, as a coordinate conjunction, it means result. He studied hard, so he passed the test. He passed the test because he studied hard. Same meaning. So this is the action, this is the result. If you do it the other way around, then you have the reason for the result. As a subordinate, you're using so, usually so that. You don't have to use that, and I'll show you that in a second. But this is an adverb clause. It's showing result or purpose or conclusion, basically meaning like, therefore, something. So subordinate clause, coordinate clause. He studied hard so that he could pass the test. What is the purpose? So here we're talking about purpose. What is the purpose of his hard studies? The purpose is to pass the test. So here I'm using so to show that. Now, notice I put that in brackets. Why? Because you realistically can take it out. He studied hard so he could pass. I'm still keeping purpose as the function here, but I'm taking out that because it's generally understood. I don't need to have it there. And then your clause, he could, subject, verb. Now, a few things to notice. One, comma, no comma. In the coordinate conjunction, you're going to put a comma to show that it's a coordinate conjunction and to show that you're following with a result, not a purpose. Here, no comma, because it's all one idea connected to show purpose. And again, that with or without. You can't add that to the coordinate conjunction. Now, another more very formal way to use so and so that is putting the so before the passive verb. The test was so written that it was almost impossible to pass. Essentially what this means is the test was written such that it was impossible to pass, or the test was written in a way that made it impossible to pass. But that's a very long sentence. So what I want to do is I want to shrink it using so, or such that. Again, same meaning in a way that is what this means. This one, generally I say try to avoid because a lot of people will make a mistake. You have to put it between the be verb and the passive participle. And a lot of people forget to do that. And you have to use that. You can't take it out. You can't say the test was so written, it was almost. In spoken English, you can get away with it. In written, you shouldn't do that. Now, let's look at some more examples. Negative, doesn't matter, same idea. He didn't study hard. He didn't do this action. The result, comma, so, he won't pass the test. Don't worry about the verb tenses for now. But when you're using so that with a negative independent clause, the meaning is a little bit different. He didn't study hard so that he would pass the test. This was not his purpose for studying hard. There was a different purpose. That's what when you're studying with the negative, you're showing that this is not the purpose maybe most people think. There's a different purpose. And usually, you would go on to explain that second or alternative purpose. He didn't study so hard. He didn't study hard so that he would pass the test. He studied hard so he could impress his professor. So this is the reason. This was his purpose in studying hard, not the first one. And you're always going to have the two purposes mentioned. One that's not and one that is with the negative. Try to remember that. It's a little bit tricky. Whenever you see a negative, so that, remember this is not the actual purpose. Now, there's another way you can write this sentence. He studied so hard so he could impress his professor. This so, the first one, means very, like a lot. This one, purpose. Technically, this sentence is correct. Don't write this sentence. Don't use both uses of so in one sentence. It's confusing to the reader. It's just a really not a pretty sentence. I can't say another way to say it. It's just not pretty. Don't do it like this. And just use a different word. He studied diligently so he could, or he studied very hard if you have nothing else. Try not to use very too often, but if you have nothing else, use very. Now, so as to, I mentioned this before, he studied hard so as to impress his professor. Just remember that it's a phrase. It's not a clause. You're following it with a phrase. He studied hard so as to pass the test. Still talking about purpose, but you're not following it with a conjunction, with a clause, sorry. You're not following it with a clause, you're following it with an infinitive phrase, okay? A few more. Oh, not a few more. I want to mention something very specifically about placement, where you put certain clauses, okay? It makes a big difference. Once he graduated, he applied to several firms in the industry that his professor had recommended so that he could gain experience right away. So I mentioned before, and I'm going to make a video about embedded clauses. Sometimes you have clauses inside of clauses, right? So here, what you have, so that he could, inside the noun clause, inside the adjective clause that his professor had recommended. So this is a little bit confusing now. So that he could gain. So we're talking about a purpose, so that. Is the purpose of the recommendation or is it the purpose of the applied? Which verb are you referring to? A lot of people would think that it's about applied. He applied because he wanted to gain experience. That makes sense. But because you have this purpose clause right after a verb, and it's an adverb clause, it's modified as a verb, it's going to automatically modify the nearest verb. So technically, his professor recommended it for this purpose, so that he could gain experience, okay? Doesn't really make sense. The professor recommended anything would give you experience. The recommended certain ones, maybe he'll get in more easily into these companies, okay? So we're gonna fix this a little bit. The easiest way, separate the professor into non-identifying adjective clause. Once he graduated, he applied to several firms in the industry. Which firms? Those which his professor had recommended, end of the adjective clause, so that he could gain. And now, so that is the purpose of applied, okay? And that's very clear with the commas. Notice I changed to which instead of that, because it's a non-identifying clause, and then it's a much clearer sentence. Or, just change the whole structure. Once he graduated, he applied to several firms in the industry on his professor's advice so that he could gain experience. Now, so that, the only verb that it can modify is applied. The only action verb it can modify is applied. And then it's a very clear sentence. I changed recommend to advice, noun, very clear sentence. So placement is very important, and punctuation obviously is very important. I have a lesson about commas. You can find a link up there as well. And so now we're talking about the therefore, okay? It is overpriced and so unaffordable to most people. Now, technically, this is a reduced clause, right? I take the subject and verb out because they're clear enough. It is overpriced and so it is, same subject and verb, I can take them out, and so it is unaffordable to most people. So basically, this is, again, conclusion, overpriced, therefore, it is unaffordable. The thing you have to be a little bit careful about, if you say it is overpriced and so unaffordable, make sure you don't think, as you're reading, that this so means a lot, like a quantifier, like very unaffordable. Then it would be a bit redundant. Overpriced generally means unaffordable to most people, right? That's what overpriced means. So it would be unnecessary. So you should understand that it is unaffordable as a result of being overpriced. Certain animals do not tolerate hunger well, and so they, I can take out, feed on each other when no other prey is present. And so therefore, they feed on each other. I don't want to put therefore or they, I take them both out, and I put and so instead to make it a little bit smoother, right? But here you need the and the so together. They work together. Okay, number 4. And this is a very, very useful use of so. It's a pronoun. And a lot of people do not use, first of all, a lot of people don't use enough pronouns in their essay writing, especially. But nobody uses the word so enough. And it's a very useful tool to have in your toolkit for writing. In doing so, they delegitimize the process. So by doing this, now this so refers to something that was already mentioned previously. And it has to be very clear that it was mentioned. The so will come right after the thing that was mentioned. And I'll give you a little bit more detailed example. Students have the option of taking one semester at an affiliated university overseas. Those students that do so, what is so? What do they do? Take one semester at an overseas university, right? I'm referring to one action because I'm using the do so. You don't have to use do, you can use other verbs with so, but again, always referring to something previously. So those that take the semester gain not only credits for the degrees, but invaluable experience and insights, etc. Now, even so, this is another combination that they go together. Even so basically means the so is working the same as this one. It's a pronoun referring to something. The even is even though, basically reduced. I take the though out because it's understood. Even so, even though something in something prior, and then you go on with your independent clause. Many companies do not like the country's tax laws. So this is the situation. Even so, even though they don't like the country's tax laws, they set up offices, etc., etc. So, even though whatever happened before, whatever was mentioned before. Make sure you recognize that this is always pointing to something. If you don't recognize it's pointing to something, you're going to connect it to something ahead of it, and you're going to completely change the meaning of the sentence, okay? And of course, collocations. There are always collocations to study. So is part of a few of these collocations. Only so many, only so much, only so often. When you use only so and whatever comes after it, you're talking about a limited amount, a limited number, limited frequency, etc. Parents have only so much time to devote to their children's development. The parents, they have to go to work, they have to go shopping, they have to clean up the house, they have to do whatever they need to do. They have a very limited amount of time to spend with their children. They have only so much time, a limit. Only so often do these whales appear in front of human observers. So you go whale watching in like Newfoundland and on the Atlantic coast there, and you want to see these whales, but they only appear so often. Okay, so which means, and notice I can split it. Only appear so often means very limited, very rarely in this case. What this means. So far means until now, until this point, whatever happened before. The project has not faced any setbacks so far. So from the beginning until now. It may face setbacks going forward, but until now, no problems. You'll often hear so far, so good. Again, not really for written, more for spoken English. Means so far, so good. Until now, no problems. So long as basically means the same as long as, right? Like a conditional if. As long as this is true as well. Again, a little bit casual, not so much for writing, more for speaking. Most children learn only so long as they are interested in the topic or the delivery of the material. Only as long as they, only if they are interested in, etc. Or so basically means approximately. 1,000 people or so came to the event. So around 1,000, approximately 1,000, maybe 10 more, 50 less, whatever. And so on, and so on is one expression, so on and so forth. Okay, so on and so forth, don't use in your writing, and so on is okay. It's very similar to etc. I use etc. a lot. The difference between etc. and so on is it's pretty subtle. And so on means you know what the continuation of the list is. It's limited. Etc. means any other example of this thing that I mentioned. I'll explain it more in a second. We will study the great writers of the 20th century, including Hemingway, Kerouac, and so on. And so on means there's only so many great novelists, and we're gonna study all of them. If I say etc., well, it's unlimited, and there's only a limited number. I can't actually technically use etc. here. I should be using and so on because there's a finite number. There's a limited number of great writers of the early 20th century. So, that's it. I know I go sometimes a little bit quick with this stuff, and I know it's a little bit tricky. Ask questions in the YouTube comment section. Make sure you talk to each other and try to help each other out. And again, the more you read and the more you engage in English, you're going to come across all of these uses. Just pay attention to the function of this word so. Is it working with a noun, with an adjective? Is it part of a clause, etc.? What is it doing? And then you'll know which of these uses. Now, there's more than just these 5 that I showed you. There are other ones. Just look up in a dictionary, put define so, and you'll see a few other ones. Study them, practice using them, etc. Okay? So if you have any questions, again, you can ask me in the YouTube comment section. If you like the video, give me a like. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and come back next week for more grammar, vocab, and writing tips. See you then. Bye-bye.